Good day, everyone, and welcome to this Bridge Talk number 32. My name is Jonas Klevhag. I'm the head of collaborations at The Bridge. As you already know, The Bridge exists to connect science and technology on one hand with business and societal development on the other hand, to push humanity forwards towards the Sustainable Development Goals. And the clock is ticking, of course. We have 8.5 years to go before this decade is out, and only a few hours to go before the second quarter of the second year of this decade is out. So we need to hurry. Today's talk is actually not a talk per se, but a conversation between three different stakeholders on different levels. And they're here to share their thoughts on why it often seems so difficult to turn policy into or high-level policies into grassroots level action and better lives for citizens. At the top level, we are joined today by Chris Raftery, representing the Scottish government, where he's head of enterprise, third sector and social investment. Scotland, as you know, has a devolved government responsible for a wide range of areas, including economy, education, health, environment, and equal opportunities, among others. And Scotland is also host to the COP26 in Glasgow in November. So welcome, Chris, and the Scottish government. It's an hour before lunch in Edinburgh, but I'm still curious. What would be a good Scottish government lunch on a day like this, if you would?
Well, first of all, thank you for the invite. I suppose a typical Scottish government lunch will be a packed sandwich with limp lettuce and a dubious coffee to accompany it by.
All right, so a traditional lunch to go, basically, or speedy grab and go lunch.
Basically, yeah. So,
okay. Well, a warm welcome. At the multinational private sector level, we have Jakob Kiefer, Group Head of Public Affairs at ABB, the Swiss-Swedish technology leader, working closely with utility, industry, transportation and technology and infrastructure customers to bring about a transition to a more sustainable future. Before joining ABB, you also have an extensive background in foreign affairs for the Swedish government. Welcome, Jakob.
Yeah, thank you for the invite. And haven't had lunch yet. We'll see. Probably no, but if there is lunch, it's probably going to be pytti panna and some eggs today.
So leftovers chopped up and fried up with a bit of an extra protein push there.
Something like that, yes. Something like that, yeah.
Traditional Swedish sustainable food, I'd say.
Yeah, it's the quickest, at least.
Very good, very good. Really, really nice, actually. Not quite sure if it's how close it is to haggis, but
it's not so far. I think maybe a bit more meaty, I guess, but otherwise it's not so far. I think
it's funny how the traditional dishes usually summarize actually the leftover thing in a nice way, but in different ways, of course, across the world. Very sustainable, nevertheless, and
recycled.
And recycled completely. Yeah. Thank you for joining us today, Jakob.
Thanks a lot.
We're doing this Bridge Talk actually today in collaboration with our partner in Scotland, Challenges Group, who helps Scottish solutions find their way to traction in developing countries or markets. They have local teams in sub-Saharan Africa, in Southeast Asia, and they are based in Edinburgh. And here representing Challenges Group is Neil Fleming. You're the director of Challenges Group. Warm welcome.
Good afternoon or good morning from Scotland. Yeah, thanks, Jonas. Yeah, I'm one of the directors here in Edinburgh. I was trying to think about lunch, actually, and I think had Sweden done the job last night in the football, certainly everyone in Scotland would be going for some meatballs today in our support against England. But, you know...
now you're stuck with beetroot soup, I suppose, with in the Ukrainian...
Doesn't sound quite as appetizing, but, you know, we'll have to do it. We'll have to do it. Lovely to be here.
Thank you, and thank you for the condolences on last night. It was too bad. But on the other hand, I think it levels the floor a bit with Scotland and Sweden out, except UK or England is well represented. UK is well represented by England still. So congratulations on that. Warm welcome to all of you. Now, the topic of today is around the climate issue, the global challenge of climate. COP26, the Global Climate Summit, was supposed to have happened in November in 2020, but it was postponed for obvious reasons, to November this year. IPCC will publish its assessment report number 6 early next year, but some drafts have been floating, and indications say that we are still behind schedule on the Paris Agreement. There are many estimates, but a late one estimates that at the current pace, we will reach 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels on the global temperature somewhere between 2030 and 2052. And that's not the most pessimistic estimate, actually. We all know this, of course, and yet it seems hard to speed up things. So the question we ask ourselves is, what are the big bottlenecks when it comes to turning policy into action? And I've asked all three of you to reflect on this from your position. So I'd like to start with Chris. What are your thoughts on the bottlenecks turning policy into action from the upper floors of government? What would you say?
Thank you. Thank you. I think, first of all, policy isn't that difficult. Anyone can think of a good idea. Equally, people can think of bad ideas. It's putting them into practice, which is the most difficult part. Operationalizing what is a policy, what is a good policy, and that's reliant on others. It's not just for government, and it needs to be collaborative in the approach, and it also needs to be bottom up as well. So what does that mean? It needs the strategic direction that's often provided by national government. You need partners, whether that be in the public, private, or third sectors, doing their bit, often leading the way, incidentally, and that's something that policymakers often have to try and play catch up with what's going on. But it also needs to buy in from the general public. Policies, as a general rule, there isn't a policy really that is that hits everybody equally. They just simply don't exist. Climate change is one of those. Everybody has vested interest, whether that be good or bad, and the desire to make change possible. But I think the groundswell of opinion is that obviously climate change is probably the world's biggest issue right now, and it's about sort of working together collaboratively to get things done. The difficulty with climate change in particular, I think, is its complexity, and there's lots of different facets to how we're going to meet that. You mentioned before around Jonas, around sort of 1.5 degrees. What does that means a lot to policymakers, scientists, and people in the industry. But what does it actually mean to people on the street? If you're in the cold climes of parts of Sweden or Scotland, for instance, 1.5 degrees might actually sound quite attractive to some people, but it's about the education of what does that actually mean in practice, how that's going to hit you in your lives, and to also educate people and communicate with people what they need to be able to do as well. And it's all very well national governments, the UN, etc., setting all these targets, but what does that actually mean for organizations and to people as well? And we need to communicate with people and organizations in different ways all of the time, because what resonates to an organization doesn't necessarily resonate with the general public, and the actions that we need them all to take is often quite different as well.
Right. So you're talking about a collaborative approach that you need to actually to devise the policies in a good way, that so that you make sure that you don't produce rubbish policy, but good policy. And that takes collaboration with both business and public and private sector, and the third sector, as you mentioned it, the NGOs and and that kind of organizations. What examples have you seen lately where this has worked nicely, or where it hasn't worked? This kind of collaboration.
The easy question I won't point to individual things that have gone badly, but I think the reason why things land badly is because the idea is first and foremost is a bad idea, and the reason that that comes to fruition is because people haven't consulted and spoken to people that are actually on the ground. I'm a policymaker. I'm currently in charge of the third sector within the Scottish Government. Tomorrow I could be in charge of parts of health, I could be in charge of parts of education, parts of transport. Now, I don't necessarily have the in-depth knowledge of all of these areas, but the principles are still the same. And very quickly, you can walk into another job and make a positive impact. So how does a good policy work? And an example of it, I suppose, one of the positive things that has happened is through COVID, has been, and I think this has been the case all over the world, is people have come together, collaborated. They've put potentially, what in the grand scheme of things are minor differences aside, to work in one direction and to deliver something. As an example, in Scotland, at the start of the pandemic here in Scotland, which was around sort of the middle of March, when the country was going into lockdown, in partnership with a few key stakeholders within the sector, we launched a support program which was worth about £25 million to the sector within 5 days. Something like that would normally have taken 6 months, a year, 2 years if we were going through that. So climate change presents us with a different problem. It's in a sense, but the principles are still the same. Climate change is happening now. We all know that, but the people can't see it maybe as acutely as they perhaps with COVID, and so it's about focusing the mind as well, and the way that everybody carries on their business.
Yeah, you talked about communication also to the public and education of the public or businesses and organizations, perhaps even the policymakers, I suppose, to be educated in what 1.5 degrees means in actual terms, not in vacation weather terms, but in actual business terms and sustainable future terms. Do you think that, I mean, comparing the 1.5 degree dilemma or translation dilemma with the pandemic communication situation, where you had a much more clear way of communicating the sense of urgency, how do you see that could be used, or how could you use the logic of the pandemic to increase the sense of urgency in the 1.5 degree communication dilemma?
Yeah, there's certainly principles that we can take from that. Part of it, I think, is always around identifying who your key partners are, and there's always lots of organisations out there, and I don't mean this in any disrespect, who can offer an opinion on what not to do. But actually, the people that you want to listen to are the ones that can are giving you solutions and can help you implement them. So what we were able to do through the pandemic is to narrow that down, and I suppose that noise that's often there that can be distracting, we can work quite positively and quite quickly, because the more voices that you need to listen to, and I'm not advocating that you can't listen to everybody, you absolutely can, but you need to know what you're going to do with that information. So in terms of that's a really powerful way of getting delivery done quickly. But in terms of climate change in particular, there's so many different elements to that. You're not going to be able to. You're going to have separate strands for every individual thing, and the public need to know that you can turn your lights off, for instance, and that will save power. But that's not going to necessarily save a problem with overconsumption with plastic packaging, which is another part of that, etc., etc. So they need to understand the relationship between all of that. And I'm hopeful in that. I see sort of. I've got a 6-year-old daughter. She comes home from school and she tells me about it in relatively simple terms. It's the polar bears. It's this, that, and the other that we're hurting, etc. I never got that when I was in school. I won't give you my age, but it was a couple of decades ago at least. So there is something there, and there is a much more appreciation that this is something that is happening now, rather than some abstract concept maybe 30 years ago.
So bringing in Neil and Jakob as well to reflect on your thoughts here. Neil or Jakob, what would you say that you have a background in policy making in Swedish governments as well? Immediate thoughts on what Chris brings up here on bringing about good policy, making it collaborative, and turning policy into good communication. Where do you see this land? What are your thoughts on immediate thoughts?
A lot of what Chris says resonates with me. I was some chief of staff with the Minister of Trade. I was chief of staff with the Minister of Defense. In both those instances, for example, when we worked with the trade minister, was to see how can we make globalization work? How does the trading system really bring prosperity to the planet? And why are these protests happening? And what are the flaws? And when you start to look at that sector, it's very complex. It's about bringing some type of issue to a global level, right? When we worked with the Swedish defense, you would think that is not so complex. It was extremely complex. Everything that carries a number of systemic parts in it, and when you start to move those to a different direction, it's a very, very laborious process. I was working in China, trying to understand this gigantic market. How could we, as a small country, navigate in that country, and how could we assist them? How could we understand how you make business and what are the risks and complexities around that? And I was doing the same thing in Chile, but maybe then working with mining sector. And once you start to look at an issue, it looks quite simple. Why couldn't we just reduce this and that with XY%? But when you look at the climate challenge from our perspective now, when I sit in this position, it's a tremendous challenge, because everything we do is based basically on energy. We need energy to survive. Energy comes from somewhere, and today 80% comes from fossils. And we know the demand for energy will double in the coming years, right?
Indeed.
And where does the new energy come from? We can't take away the old energy, and we have to do many things at the same time. And what I can see, I like the title you have put on this show, but I don't think there's not a gap between policy. It's not that we don't understand each other. It's just how can we make enlightened decision today that will last for a long, long time. And where does the policy maker need to step up, and where does we need to step up? And I believe, for example, when it comes to energy, we cannot build the grid, for example. We cannot rebuild the grid. We can supply things to the grid, but it will be states and nations and regions that decide what type of grid do they want. Scotland, fantastic example when you're using wind power. And I think United Kingdom is actually one of those countries that come the farthest in the shortest time to replacing fossils with clean energy. And they have set a target, and we can deliver the technical solutions. But it takes leadership to do so. And it's easy to do maybe if in the United Kingdom. But if you're, say, in Ghana or you're in Indonesia, where you don't have those resources and the state is weak, how can we bring our green technology to these parts of the world? These are the issues that I think are really interesting to see how we can come together. And that takes maybe global leadership, it takes regional leadership and local leadership. And this is only for the low-hanging fruits. And I can talk to you about the high-hanging fruits in a minute.
Yes, Jakob, we'll come back to your reflection from the ABB point of view, and you've sort of touched on it already, but I also hear you can confirm or second what Chris is talking about in terms of the importance of collaborating or understanding the industries when making the policies. Neil, you sort of more of a on the ground traction on the ground in the local markets perspective. What do you think that when you're working closely with the Scottish government as well, I'm sure. So what is your reflection immediately on Chris's thoughts here?
No, it's good. I was transported back in my mind, Chris, actually, to sitting in a minibus in Ethiopia with Chris and one of the Scottish ministers. And I think Chris mentioned you can tell you don't work for government, Neil, with what you're saying. And I've never been involved in making policy. I've not worked for governments, and I think what I see is so many challenging factors. I think the positives to take in light of Chris's points on COVID is we were able to see how quickly policies could be brought in, and certainly within Chris's team, and we work with Chris. The decisions that potentially might have taken 12, 18 months were made in 4 or 5 days, and they were done right, and certainly from what we've seen and what we've experienced. And I think the positives is we've seen how quickly governments can move. My worry is with climate is such an all-encompassing issue, and there is so many people involved. And I think from an on the ground point of view, from organisations working in that space, whether it's climate change locally in Scotland, whether it's organisations we work with in Rwanda, which has a very strong policy environment, has a very clear direct route of where it's going, and can do so because it's a small country, and they've had a leader in place for 25 years now. It doesn't seem like he's moving, and he seems to be going in the right direction. But the impacts of the policy in Rwanda are a minuscule drop in the ocean when it comes to the global climate. And I think it's been able to, as Chris said, I think, listen to the right voices. In Scotland right now, as you mentioned, Jacob, Jonas, we have COP happening in November. I think there's a lot of voices, there's a lot of opinions, there's a lot of people trying to bring in the impact of what they see overseas. There's a lot of impact on Scotland. I think there's so many voices being thrown into the mix that I think it's actually hard to pick apart kind of how you pull that into policy. And I think my only concern as well, which we had an interesting chat last week about, was I think there's going to be a tiredness in government because everyone's been absolutely battered, as a Scottish term, for the last 18 months because of COVID. And my worry is the climate piece doesn't seem as urgent to probably the majority of the population as individuals, because if I look at our work in, say, Rwanda or Uganda or Malawi or Zambia, everyone in our teams and everyone we're working with are seeing it every day, the impact of climate. We're not seeing it in Scotland. We're not seeing it in Sweden maybe as much. And therefore, in terms of getting public buy-in to policy, getting corporate buy-in, getting the third sector buy-in, I think is going to prove difficult to actually pull together and implement the right policies, particularly, how do we deal with the financial and just the people burden of the last 18 months of what's been a much more urgent emergency. So
if I hear you correctly, then you have an important part to play in the education of the policymakers and perhaps even the businesses of in Scotland and Sweden and the Nordic, to bring the grassroots stories and the effects of the climate challenge into real perspective and to real urgency, to help that translation. So thank you for sharing your thoughts on Chris's reflections. I'll move on now. So we've sort of dealt with the policy perspective and the government levels. Now, Jakob, you were bringing us further into the rest of the world and an international perspective, and taking us to different industries and different types of strengths of government, and how that makes it difficult for you to operate and to provides a challenge in scaling your solutions internationally. What do you see as the bottlenecks when, as a multinational transition maker, when it comes to turning policy into action in a broader sense?
If I think the short answer is digitalization. I think I mean that's something that we've seen now during the COVID, how quickly the world could all of a sudden operate, but we were sitting in our homes. It's a very simple example, but the most things that are happening now is actually around digitalization, the way we can put sensors on all machines and services to be more effective. And these takes also type of policies, but this is an area where I think policymakers might not be so versed. So that is a little bit of a, you know, on the technological side. And a lot of the things we are doing are on the technological side, solutions that are quite complex. You want, for example, to change a machine park that is old. And I think I spoke to you when we were preparing for this meeting about why is it that we allow old motors and drives to be running from year to year, even though we have new efficient ones on the market. We have invested quite a lot in R&D, and we know that the old drives and the old motors maybe use 60-70% more energy than the new ones. So if we were switching out all of these motors and drives globally, we could save the energy of the whole consumption of China during a year. And this is not happening because there are perhaps not enough incentives. Maybe the price on energy is too low. Maybe the investment cost is too high. And here you enter into, you know, a market mechanism, but also policy decisions. I wouldn't say it's simple, but I think the European Union has taken tremendous steps towards that. There's a new eco design coming into force in 2 years' time. So things are happening. But I think what many people feel, in particular the younger generation, is that why does it take so long? And do we have the time? And that is a big question.
Would you say that the economic incentives that you talk about here, that perhaps energy prices are too low, there's no reason to invest, and perhaps investments are too expensive to make, would you say then that these economic incentives to bring about a transition needs to be harmonized throughout the world in a better way, so that they don't differ so much? Would that be a bottleneck or obstacle to remove?
Well, I think they're working with those mechanisms, and I think we have to acknowledge that it's, you know, a market is a functioning place if everything is put in the right order. The cost for CO2 emissions, should we have a global market for CO2 emissions, for example? How do we put that in place? Because then you will have a tremendous shift from fossils to greener technologies, and that is happening, I think, in many countries already. But we don't have a global emissions trading system. We have a European trading system, but not for all sectors. So I think there are economic incentives certainly that could be used. And once you talk to put a cost on a commodity, and in this sense it will be on pollution, change will happen more rapidly than politicians could imagine, I think. And we're seeing that already. That, you know, wind is now more a rentable source than fossils in some markets because of the cost of emitting. And so I think the policy making is certainly there is important.
And as an international operator on the market, what kind of leverage would you have towards the policymakers to actually bring about these clearer clarification of incentives when it comes to promoting this transition?
Well, I don't think we leverage so much. I think we have always been, we don't sell end products, really. We are a business-to-business operator that try to provide solutions to other industries and other customers. So, you know, when we see this transition happening, for example, should we now go into a future of hydrogen? Okay, what does it take to bring a new energy system on the market based on hydrogen? How do we do that together? And there we need government support and investment in bright brains that can come out from the universities, but we can also bring our system solutions. What is that a hydrogen or the type of technology needs to be effective. So I think in all honesty, I don't think there's a dichotomy between policymakers and business. It's just that sometimes there's a little bit of different perspective and pace also. And sometimes we can come up with solutions that policymakers simply are not ready for. And therefore, we need to engage in these type of conversations. So for us, I think it's quite exciting times. But in order for us to be able to participate, we need to do two things. One is to keep our own house in order, have science-based targets that we can reach, and we actually just adopted those, and they were, scrutinized, and we were accepted this year. And this is happening not only in ABB, it's happening all across the globe, I would say. There's no multinational company today that's not taking this extremely serious. And that is a fantastic thing. So I have the sensation right now that maybe industry and the private sector is moving a bit faster than policymakers. So I'm quite optimistic, but yet the question lingers, how do we get the whole world on board? Not only the European Union. Will Biden be successful in his bid? And what about China? Will China be able to be carbon free 2060? And isn't that too late, given the fact that they will still, continue to use coal as a majority of their energy source? How can we bring that together?
So, Neil and Chris, would you like to come in and comment on Jakob's reflection here, that there are perhaps not the technology is there, it's ready to be installed, but the incentives are perhaps not clear enough to bring about the change fast enough. What as a government representative, when a company like ABB comes to you and says that we need to clarify the incentives here and make the odds better in favor of better technology, how would a government be able to act on that?
That's a really difficult question. I think, rightly or wrongly, the truth of the matter is that that governments are all split into arguably different silos, and we do try and work across each other, and that's one of the other benefits, and something I hope we don't lose in government over COVID, is that we've been able to do that. So to be able to answer that question, you would need to have somebody that's overall in charge of those incentives, when in reality it's probably a number of different policy areas. So it's extremely difficult to sort of get those to marry up. Now, that does sound very much like sort of a bureaucratic challenge, and it really is. But the other part of it as well is, we've spoken about policymakers as well, is politicians. Policymakers come up with ideas, hopefully deliver them, or deliver a politician's ideas, and the two don't always go well together, and politicians can disagree within the same parties, etc., with different focuses, and for absolutely good reason. So it adds an extra layer of complexity there. So unfortunately, I haven't got a magic wand that can't provide some sage advice on how to fix that particular problem.
But a good way to actually create that collaboration that you were talking about initially. Neil, you work more with perhaps smaller companies on the ground in developing markets and in Scotland, smaller than ABB usually. But do you see the same picture, same dynamics that Jakob is talking about here when it comes to promoting a transition?
Yeah, I think so, and I think the point I took from Jakob there is 100% the private sector moves much quicker than government, and we see that in Scotland, and we see that in the countries that we work in, where certainly more smaller SMEs who make up the 80% of the economy in the countries we're working in, and in Scotland, they are moving very fast. And I think there's also other government policy in there around to support that. So we are working right now with a whole host of different innovations in Scotland, some of which are in the energy space, one of which is looking at solar thermal heating. And for water, and you know, there's so many different layers to this climate issue, and actually I've now learned a lot in the last 2 years of heating hot water is you know, one of a huge contributor to that.
Mm-hmm.
You know, so there's a climate policy, but then there's also you know, an economic policy, an entrepreneurship policy, support policies that sit around how do we get innovations to market, how do we get them to the point that they can scale, how do we get them actually used. And you know, again, on Jakob's point as well, that so it then comes down to economics as well. So you know, you can have the greatest solution in the world, but if no one's going to actually pay to use it, or there's not incentives to use it, it's just going to sit in a lab, and it's not going to have that impact. And so what I mean, if we look at it from, you know, on the ground in certain African markets, SMEs are light years ahead of any government policy coming in to actually support what it is they're trying to do. You know, but then they're also competing, and so, you know, again, this falls back into government or policy or politicians, where potentially then not the best technology is given the green light because it's more economically advantageous. Therefore, you know, that dominates the market, and the one thing that could change that doesn't get a chance to shine. You know, and I think what we're excited about, if I'm honest, you know, and I think when we look at the markets we work in, and certainly a large part of what we're doing right now is trying to take innovations in this space into African markets. What they're able to do is leapfrog anything we're doing here, because they're not sitting as, you know, if we're looking at Rwanda, rural Zambia, Malawi, they're not sitting with everyone connected to the grid. This is how it's always been. I don't really think about how my light's powered. I just pay my electricity bill every month. They're seeing, well, you know, I have to bring in solar. We have to bring in microgrids. We have to bring in mini grids. We have to ensure that we reuse our water. We have to do this because it affects us day to day. And actually, we're looking to make that step up. And I think there's opportunities actually for kind of models, ideas, and delivery to be coming back into the global north now, and actually learning a lot about some of these policies that have been implemented in the countries we're working.
So you have experiences working with the larger companies like ABB in these developing markets as well, but representing an SME perspective. How can SMEs and the ABBs work together on in these markets? How, in your experience?
Sometimes it goes well, sometimes it doesn't. You know, and I think it's about pace of change, and unfortunately, it comes down to kind of competing priorities. You know, so I mean, we work with a couple of larger mining companies across the continent, and less on climate and more on, I don't know, I suppose them looking at their exits and how they reinvest back into the communities that they've, you know, extracted a lot of value over the years. And I think we're starting to see the gap narrowing, and I think people are starting to come together a lot more. And ultimately for us, you know, the companies like ABB and the private sector are really what can adopt these smaller innovations and take them to scale. And actually, if you can take the knowledge, the investment, the scale of an ABB and bring that together with a smaller innovator in somewhere like Rwanda or Ghana, or that's where I think you can start to see change happen. And actually almost, you know, it's going to happen, and it's probably necessary that the policymakers are then playing catch up to that. Because if we just sit and wait on policy, it's not going to happen. And therefore, you know, I think it's about kind of trying to rebalance that, the role of policy almost reinforcing what is happening on the ground where the change needs to occur. And I think we have some relationships with larger multinationals. The attitude, the desire, and the action is there, and we are seeing a lot more collaboration, a lot more deliberate and focused collaboration. Even things like CSR now is not, you know, let's just do some good. It's actually how do we bring this into our whole business model and drive that whole success?
So I'm curious, Jakob, what experiences do you have working with the smaller companies of the SMEs, the innovative SMEs in these markets?
Well, there are two aspects to it, really. I mean, I guess in the old days, when I was younger, so much younger than today, you probably had you had the big companies like ABB, and they were working fixing everything themselves. And I think the change now in the globalized world where everything is online, and we work through a lot through media applications, and the world has become smaller in the sense that it's more accessible now for small and medium-sized companies to actually be global and much faster. And we also realize that we might have a lot of inventions in our R&D department that we might not feel that we're ready to go with, but we still want to explore it. So what we did actually was to create the space called Synerleap, where we can offer a physical space and all our digital space around our headquarters, where we can either invite companies to be part of our ecosystem. We can bring some of our business developers, and we can even own part of these companies, exactly to do what Neil is saying. How do you scale up? It's quite easy to come with this new type of light that you can have at night, whatever, or the future water. But how do you scale this up if you want to have a massive production globally? And how do you have the service around that? Extremely complex. And this is usually where companies fail. It's not the first 50 million that they spend. It is when they really want to scale up. And I think that's what's happening right now, that this idea of collaboration is really taking hold, not only at ABB. I think we had it as a culture, but it's a global phenomenon now, because everybody wins in the end. We will be able to offer our solutions to this company. That company can grow, find capital, but also use digital platforms, applications to reach markets that were probably impossible maybe just 30 years ago. Today you can go to the countryside, they have a cell phone, you have a cell phone, good, then we can work. So it's I'm quite hopeful, and that's why that's a cool thing about being in a private company, how they are organized and how we organize ourselves to be able to really go to 100 markets at the same time, more or less. And that's the difference between policymakers who is extremely laborious sitting in the UN waiting for a resolution. But also there, once it's done, it trickles down. And that's why COP26 is so important. Bring it back to our topic for today. We know what we need to do. We know what the levels has to become if we are going to reach there. And we will be scrutinized as countries, as companies, as we move towards Glasgow. So slow, yes, but global. And that's the nice thing about globalism. We don't talk about globalism as something positive anymore. I think we should. It's the only way forward. We tried, where we have seen what happens when countries go a little bit on their own. It's not been a healthy state of affairs, and I think maybe climate could be that unifier if you look at from my old hat as a diplomat.
Of a long-term unifier, whereas the pandemic is in the short-term unifier, perhaps. Thank you for sharing your reflections on Jakob's main thought that the economic incentives need to be harmonized or need to be clearer. So, Neil, you're the director of Challenges Group. What do you see as the main obstacles from your perspective as an agency on the ground in developing countries, turning policy into action?
I think there's a few. I mean, I think, it comes to getting people's buy-in, I think, ultimately. And I think, if we look at it, both in the countries where we work and including Scotland and the wider UK, I think there's so much narrative, and people are much more informed these days. There's almost too much information in people's view, and being able to build a policy that can unite people, I think, is probably nigh on impossible. And going back to sort of Chris's original reflections around having been able to listen to enough of the voices, but be able to understand which voices are going to take things forward, I think is probably the biggest challenge, and therefore it kind of delays the process, And I think if we are looking at it from the countries that we operate in, they probably operate in a very different way compared to, say, a Scottish government or a Swedish government, where not to say anything controversial, but I think in a place like Rwanda or Uganda, they're not listening to what people are saying. They're making their own decisions, and they're driving the policy forward on that. Mm-hmm. That has positives and that has negatives. And I think if we're looking at, say, the global north and the governments who are still in the countries who are still driving the majority of carbon emissions, China and India, places like that as well. We're seeing amazing policy, and we're seeing amazing drives forward in a lot of our African sites, but they're not really emitting a lot. They're the ones that are feeling the massive impact of it because they're having droughts, because they're not. That then leads to power somewhere like Zambia, which has really gone hard on hydro and dam power. The droughts are hit, and there's just constant power outages across the whole country now, all the time. And so they can have some policies that they bring in, but they're not really contributing to climate change in the same way that we are here in Europe, or that we are in the States or in China. And so I think there is this global collective that Jakob touched on that's actually needed now, and it's I think being able to bring about and probably make some quite hard decisions as well. And I think that's also where the private sector has a role to play, because I think if I look at this as an individual and I look at climate change, and I was having a discussion with my fiance the other day where, they brought in policies around things like banning of plastic straws. That's lovely. That's not going to stop climate change. But people feel, that they're making a difference, or, I'm not going to, if it's looking at plastic or it's looking at consumption, individuals, I think, are making much more informed decisions, and some policies come in around that. But that doesn't get us to the targets we need. It has to be private sector, and it has to be the commercial and these big emissions that are happening. I think we're at a really interesting point now coming out of COVID, when there's a real opportunity when it comes to climate change to really relook at at the aviation industry, at our use of flying, at this kind of ease of flying, and travel not really being a luxury anymore for people. And I think it's going to be an interesting sort of 12 months. We're seeing it in the UK and Scotland right now, where they're starting to open up again a little bit of travel, because they're being pushed by the aviation industry. Now, being pushed by that aviation industry does not lend itself to climate-focused policies until we bring in hydrogen flights, which, Jakob, you might know more than me, but it feels like we're a long way off of that. And so I think being able to, from a policy level, actually kind of make much harder decisions and much more focused, and pushing the private sector a lot more is probably where I think it has to go. And that ultimately is the bottleneck, because you then have competing egos and perspectives and, acquaintances, allegiances, things like that actually stop the right sort of policies coming in. And I think we see a lot of strong policy being brought in the markets we're working in, that's been backed up by on-the-ground delivery, but actually their contribution to the global climate crisis is very, very small. And it's how can we learn a lot from those types of policies to bring in and ensure that we do it then in places like UK or Sweden or importantly the States and China. We know all the stats. It's if the US and China commit and actually start to change, that has a huge impact, and I think that then brings everyone else along with them.
Listening to all three of you, it's so inspiring to both hear the on the ground perspective, the international big scale perspective, and then the policy perspective at the same time. But if I can have you all back into on the screen, it almost sounds like it's not perhaps only about turning policy into action, but listening to Neil and Jakob, so the SME and the multinational, international perspective of private sector perspective, when you work together, that's so much faster than the average government policy coming into play. So maybe it's not so much about turning policy into action as it is turning action into policy. So that actually you, Chris, would have a job in listening to what's actually going on and then trying to support it with good policy in collaboration with these parties. Would that be a sort of a fair takeaway, Chris, saying that policy could actually be made based on the action that is taking place?
Absolutely. I think there's policies about strategic direction. But like I said before, most policymakers aren't experts in their given area. So naturally, you have folk in the private and third sectors that are leading the way. It's how quickly do you adjust to what's in front of you, and then see what's happening in the future. And you only get that from through collaboration, really. So we are always, not always, but we're usually one step behind as as a minimum. I suppose it is about sort of making faster decisions as well that need to be made, because lots of what's been discussed today have implications elsewhere, such as inequality, for instance, and the burden that incentives have. Largely, the burden falls on people with least money, etc. Is that right? What can you do about it? So it's a really complicated picture.
Of course. Would you say that combining your role now at ABB Group and your previous roles in governments, that there's a window of opportunity here to actually turn action into policy, as we sort of heard between the lines here?
Yeah, but I think the image is double. I'm hesitating what to answer here, because on the one hand you see this tremendous development. You see politicians putting sustainability and climate change to the core of the policy. And I know Chris, we work with policy. It's like turning this tanker around, this magnificent ship that you want to go in this strategic direction, as you say. And it's not so easy, but that direction is there now. And I think the more we work and the more we understand the complexities, we can start to really take an issue at an issue. And I think sometimes you get overwhelmed with this climate debate because it's too big to handle. That's where you have this straw or plastic tax that we have in Sweden that is symbolic. You need something to hold on to, while the big trends are perhaps what we are into, oil and gas, and we're working with energy systems, and we're working with the electrification and all those things that will really have a tremendous impact. That doesn't mean that consumers doesn't have an impact. They have a tremendous impact, because what they choose eventually, what they ask for eventually, will be a deciding factor. And mind you, we have to keep our own house in order, but we will also put pressure on our stakeholders, our suppliers. From where does your electricity come when we buy from you? Is it sustainable, or is it? And if not, we might turn to another. We give you 5 years to turn around. So once you start entering all these types of incentives, because you simply cannot operate as a multinational anymore the old way, you have to start to use scope 1, scope 2, scope 3 to really push the boundaries. Otherwise, it's impressive if we can lower our emissions with 80 or 100% to 2030, which we have committed to. But it's even more impressive if we can commit our customers to go that direction. Our impact is so much higher than our own business. And states, and finally, I would just say this, policymakers are already, you have governments here, but if you look at the government agencies and the cities and the councils, they are big buyers on the market. What they put as requirements for us, are they really interested in electrifying the next bus fleet, for example? Yes. In Edinburgh and in Glasgow, we have delivered one of the first systems with electrified buses for the local city. That was a conscious decision that was more expensive for the city, but they took that drive, showing the others that this is possible, it's feasible. They took a chance with ABB. We wonderful for us to deliver, but also show leadership, And then we say, okay, this investment we did in this product was worthwhile. Otherwise, we might have said, okay, nobody's buying because it's a little bit more expensive. But there, I think policy has a tremendous impact when it comes to procurement.
I also think, thank you so much for sharing. I think also that there is tremendous power in listening to all three levels of this dilemma, turning policy into action, or for that matter, devising policy after looking after what action works, and the good examples. But we're approaching the end of this lunch conversation, and what I've noted down is that some conclusions would be that we need good collaborative policy rather than rubbish policy, and collaborative policy in the sense that it might actually not just be pointing the direction from the higher offices or the higher levels, but actually listening to the traction, to the market, and to the private sector, what is going on, to actually devise the policies to support that action. So in a collaborative way. And then we need communication and education to translate the difficult stories into more graspable ones. The ones that reaches not just the breakfast tables, but also the boardrooms of the companies and organizations, and also the policymakers, perhaps. And finally, the economic incentives need to be clarified in favor of a sustainable transition on a global level, bringing in the global perspective that you pointed out, Jakob. Of course, the global perspective is needed for a global challenge. So that any more last comments of the conclusions that we've made today? Yes, Neil?
Just on, I think, Jakob, on your last point, I think is nailed it, really. I mean, I think it's, if we have large, as you said, you're pushing your own supply chain and then starting to push your own customers, that's how change comes about. I think we're at a point probably where a lot of people have a mistrust and don't want to listen to government. But if they're actually then, if it's the clothes that they're buying, or if they're going to IKEA, if they're buying a car, if they're buying a new heating system for their house, whatever it is, if that is held within the companies, as you've touched on there, and that's where I think the change starts to really happen, and then policy can start to come in around it. That's what drives huge change, and that is how you convince people, and that's how you bring people along that journey, by saying, well, we're doing it, can you come along with us too? Not a government saying, this is the policy, don't do this, or you must do this. I think that is how we see transformative change around the world.
Yeah, I just add to that, because I mean, sometimes it might have sounded as if I say we're going to tell our suppliers if you don't. It's not like that. It's a cooperative spirit, I think. And I mean, as a company, you always work with what you call productivity, to get more out of each unit. And we believe that the whole supply chain and that whole thing holds together. And it is a cost for us as a company, as a brand, to be supplied by something that is not sustainable. And usually, if we are supplied with something that we believe has a cost, in this case, it would be a cost of energy, it will be coming from a fossil, it will bring us in a wrong direction, and that would not make us as productive should we choose something else. And I think that's the interesting part of being in a company, that your mindset is more about productivity, the brand name, how do you make this happening? And it's a very positive feeling, I say. Whereas if you're in policy, you might, okay, how can we put a higher tax and a higher level to almost a little bit like you want to steer a behavior by putting, almost penalties on a certain behavior. So the stick and carrot, I certainly believe in, but in the private sector, I think the drive right now is a lot about the carrot. There are so many opportunities out there. But certainly the government is also this stick, and right now we're trying to see, okay, how would that stick look like? Taxonomy in the EU, what will happen if you don't do this and that? So you need both. But I mean, for me, there's such an intrinsic value of being really sustainable. You cannot greenwash, whitewash anymore. It's yesteryear, because you're being scrutinized to the last row in your book. So thank you very much for having me on this wonderful conversation, and great to talk to you, Neil and Chris.
And any last comment from the government, Chris, on this short one?
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree with all that both have said. I think there are some really easy things to do right across government. A strike of a pen, we can commission things, so there's net zero at the height of everything. But as Jakob has said, it needs to be done in collaboration. So there's lots of small things that can be done, which are really straightforward in a lot of ways. But yeah, big challenge ahead for us all, I think. But it is. I like Neil's. I think term a global collective, and I think that's exactly what it is.
Right. With this, I would like to just say thank you to Chris Raftery, Scottish Government, Jakob Kiefer, ABB Group, and Neil Fleming, Challenges Group, for joining us this lunch conversation on this important topic. And thank you to all of you who have listened in. You will get more Bridge talk on hot pre-COP topics in August and onwards, building up towards the COP26 in November. Please stay tuned for more Bridge stuff by following The Bridge on our website, thebridge.se, or through our LinkedIn account. With this, I say thank you very much and have a lovely rest of the day.